It's telling me I'm early. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect PT. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. And we have an exciting guest today to celebrate World Water Day. We have Dr. John Stolz, someone who we're very familiar with. He is a professor of the Department of Biological Sciences and the director of the Center for Environmental Research and Education at Duquesne University. His career has been dedicated to studying the microbial metabolism of metals and metalloids and microbial communities in hypersaline environments and water quality. He has published 103 peer-reviewed articles, 47 book chapters, and authored and edited 3 books. And we're going to talk about his most recent book at the end of this discussion today, and where you can get that book. That is The Environmental Impacts from the Development of Unconventional Oil and Gas Reserves. And so thank you so much for joining us today, John. Welcome. Today our presentation is centered around water because it's World Water Day. And I'm excited to learn from you, as many of your students do, on a regular basis. But hopefully, folks that are listening can learn about the type of research that you've done and the water testing that you've done. I know you have done a ton of work with different water sources throughout PA. So in celebration of protecting those precious resources today, we're going to get right into it. And thank you for our team on the back end for helping with the tech. Corey, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, we're gonna get started. So thanks so much for being here today, John.
All right, thanks for having me. This is great. Yes, it is World Water Day, and again, as I was telling my students in my class, I have a class that I teach. It's called "Are We Our Planet's Keeper?" and it's based on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and so we deal with a lot of different things. And we're about to, in fact, later today, we're going to be talking about water and life underwater, if you will. So it is quite appropriate that today is a water day. We live on a planet that's 3/4 water or covered with water, but the reality is that not a lot of it is drinkable or potable, as we would say. Obviously we don't have gills, and you know, and even freshwater fish, most of them would have an issue if you put them into, say, an open ocean environment. So it's really important that we understand that a fraction of that water that is on the planet is actually potable for us. And it's essential. I mean, we're over 70% water ourselves. And so it really does make sense for us to protect our water. And today I'm just going to go over a few things, talk a little technical stuff, but essentially, what are the threats to our sources of water that include, sources that provide water in a private water well. There's over 3 million water wells in the state of Pennsylvania, which is pretty amazing. To me, it was a surprise. I grew up in New York on Long Island, and so I always was used to city water, if you will, or public water. But moving to Pennsylvania and finding out that, a short drive from where I work, and even where I live, is basically you're in a rural setting and people are relying on groundwater. So again, that's first definition here. We have surface and groundwater. Surface, obviously, the streams and rivers and things like that. But groundwater is what's beneath, and that often is the source of both private and public water. So here we go. How did you get started with your work? So again, before fracking came along, I was happy challenging the poultry industry because my research at that time was actually working on an extreme environment in Northern California called Mono Lake. Mono Lake is It's a volcanic lake that has a pH about 9.8, which is very alkaline. It also has 3 times the salinity of seawater, so it's somewhat of an extreme environment, but it has high concentrations of arsenic. And my interest was, there were microbes living in this lake. How are they doing it, and how are they metabolizing it? And that led to a whole bunch of different studies, biochemistry, etc. But in doing that research, I discovered 2 things. One, that in Bangladesh, there were over 30 million people that were drinking unsafe levels of, or drinking water that had unsafe levels of arsenic in it. And that also here in the United States, that over 90% of the broiler chickens that were raised were being fed arsenic in their chicken feed. And it was going out in their poo. And again, what do people use chicken litter for? They use it for fertilizer. And so it was, getting out onto the farms. So again, it turns out that the combination of these things, we studied some of the microbiology, and there are microorganisms that actually metabolize arsenic. They can even use it in photosynthesis, which is pretty crazy. So getting some funding from NASA, we actually talked about planet arsenic, running the whole ecology with arsenic, which to us is very toxic. So pretty crazy stuff. And then about 10 years ago, it was actually the fall of 2009. I was preparing for my environmental biology class, and I started reading about Marcellus. And one of the things there is for those of us who do study things like groundwater contamination, subsurface environments, there's a lot of life down there, but they're limited by water and space. And what does fracking do? It creates space because you're cracking the formations, and you're introducing all these liquids or fluids. So of course I got interested, and then finding out that even the produced water is considered brine. And so it very similar to the composition of the lake water in Mono Lake. So it made a natural. So anyway, so that got me into the water testing. And once I started, I met Ron Gula, who's on his farm. He was the second Marcellus well drilled in the state, if ever. We still keep in contact. He has now moved out to Iowa. He's one of the many, we call them shale refugees. But anyway, he's making himself a new life out in Iowa. But basically, thanks to him and others, I started revamping my lab to start doing water testing. And to this day, for over a decade now, we've been providing free water testing for people with private wells, or even, surface water, because again, you can do fishing, you can do, you don't want your kids playing in a contaminated creek, right? So anyway, you want to make sure that it's safe. So we test for salts and metals. And we have a really a brandy new, actually it's a couple of years old now, gas chromatograph that we can look at light hydrocarbons like methane, ethane, and propane. And we've also analyzed, thousands of different samples, and including brines from conventional wells, brines from unconventional oil and gas wells, to kind of characterize these fluids. I know the DEP has done it, and they've come to their own conclusions. But, we figured out a way by doing some analysis of our results that we can actually tell or get an indication of whether or not a water well has been impacted by mine drainage or an oil and gas brine.
And John, one of the things that I thought was really interesting that you told me, and I think this was in a previous lunch and learn that you did with us, when we were talking about the Westmoreland sanitary landfill, and
Yeah.
the fact that they've been taking drill cuttings at that landfill for a decade, and I just was shocked by you said that the leachate is very similar to brine, to fracking brine.
Right. And so the secret, and not to get too technical, but we call it mass ratio analysis. And what that means is we look at the presence of things like magnesium and lithium and sulfate and chloride, which is basically salt, and even calcium and a couple of other things. Bromide's another good one. But by comparing not necessarily their concentrations, but also their relative abundance to one another, That's how we've been able to characterize. And unfortunately, I didn't include a graph because I didn't want to get too technical. But yeah, I mean, we were really surprised. And of course, I would say we went through the periodic table of the elements that we actually analyzed for, and did all sorts of comparisons.
Mhm.
But working with my colleague Dan Bain at the University of Pittsburgh, and my water chemist, Dr. Cantley, we came up with a suite of these elements, and we call them anions as well. That when we compare them, it may not be a lot, but if there's traces of it, and we can do this analysis, it's really telling, and we can
Mhm.
even follow over time if we take multiple samples if your water quality is changing over time.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the DEP doesn't want to utilize this methodology, but we found it very, very helpful for identifying this stuff.
Well, and it sounds really similar, like the story that you told and the journey that you have had, it sounds really similar to kind of the journey of the person who really came to craft our Environmental Rights Amendment, our Article 1, Section 27 Environmental Rights Amendment in the 70s. So it's interesting to hear that, people like you have been noticing that industry is impacting our waters, and it's really neat to find out some of the ways that you're influencing or the ways that you're working for this advocacy. So the next thing we're going to talk about, really, and my phone's ringing. Sorry about that. The next thing we're going to talk about is some of the different water supplies that you've measured. So go ahead and talk about that, John.
Well, what I did, and this is kind of interesting because I'm seeing it a little differently the way that I had it set up, but it's okay. Um, no, the important thing is, and it's funny because I was asked, and this was one of the highlights of my career. I was asked to present to the tribal council of the Seneca Nation because they were fighting a brine treatment plant that was going to take the toxic brines from oil and gas operations, and they were going to locate it at the headwaters of the Allegheny. The Allegheny goes through, and it does originate in Pennsylvania, but it goes north through the Seneca Nation and then back south. So you're talking about a watershed that is basically used, or a water system used by over 1 million people for their drinking water. And they were going to put this experimental treatment system. But what could possibly go wrong? And so I put together this scenario, and just things about using uh, not headlines, but basically news articles saying, oh, this happened and that happened and this happened and that happened. And are they related? And that's what I do as a professor. I see if there are connections. But so here we have chemical found in Youngstown area water supply pose little risk, experts say. Well, they found trihalomethanes, and where do those come from? And we're going to talk about that. And then municipal authority in Westmoreland County says not to worry about the tinted water. They had purple water. It was contaminated with manganese. They said it was from erosion. How? Okay. And then even more interesting, a testing of the Clyde mine water in Washington County found high levels of radium 226 and uranium. How does that happen? Okay, and there is a connection, technically, potentially, which is essentially that these brines that are coming up from even conventional wells have high salt concentrations, have high bromide concentrations, and have radioactive, naturally occurring um, radionuclides like radium 226 and 228. So there is a connection, and how is it getting into our drinking water sources? And that's one of the things that we've been following up. So I don't know what the next slide is.
Yeah, yeah. So the next slide is really kind of talking about that. This is something that we followed really closely. I'm going to go ahead and shut off this little box here so we can see all the text here. But yeah, we worked together on this, and we worked with some other partners when this incident happened. So I'm super familiar with this incident. But tell everybody what you
Well,
found when we were looking at this.
So there's certain things, and unfortunately, with the oil and gas industry, they like to tell you that nothing happens, and that that their activities do not pose a threat to our drinking water sources, and they refuse to actually admit or recognize that fracking itself has caused water contamination. And this is one of the examples here in which CNX was drilling a well in actually under the Beaver Run Reservoir. Okay, that provides what 150,000 people with and companies with their source of water.
Yep.
They had what was they had a failed casing, and what happened was it, and this is at over 5,000 feet. And you might say, well, geez, it's only it's 5,000 feet. That can't reach the surface. Well, what happened was that it communicated with a shallower conventional oil or gas play, rather,
Mhm.
and they had to flare 9 active conventional wells that are also in that area for fear that they would blow out and then have a really big problem. But they basically, because of the loss of fluids and pressure, they pressurized. And this is just this was from the Post Gazette article.
Yeah.
But this is what happened, and those little blue dots there show the conventional wells that had to be flared. Now, the other important thing that happens when wells are improperly constructed and have failed casings, it can often lead to what we call fugitive methane migration. And while methane itself is technically non-toxic, obviously it's flammable, and depending on the concentration, can be an issue. More importantly, for the microbes and the things that I kind of like to study, it's food. And why is that important? Because that allows them to mobilize the microbes, that is, to mobilize things like iron and manganese in these systems. So, there's a connection between these activities and stimulation of subsurface microbial activity that can lead to further mobilization of certain elements and metals. So it's not surprising that you would find something like manganese in the water supply if these activities are going on within your reservoir.
That's really
Um,
interesting. Yeah. And I know, John, that there, so when this incident happened, we did a file review with DEP, and there was at least one well that had been contaminated, and they said in the report, it said there was methane found in the wellhead of the, like, in the headspace of
yeah,
the water well. So basically methane was coming up from the water well.
yeah,
And in this case, I believe we have a report from the DEP, asked a company called Mattergenics to do a report on why did this happen? Like, how did the casing fail in the first place, causing all this? And you can see this. So this is, like you said, this is a photo from the Post Gazette. Don Hopi did an article on this, but a mile in both directions, southwest to northeast, a mile in both directions. Because, like, I don't know if you can't really tell on this map, but that I've mapped it out, and it is like literally a mile in from each direction from the wellhead. That was the casing that cracked, and this was a totally preventable incident, because the steel casing that they used was not the right casing for the type of pressure and type of fluid that they were injecting in it. So it's so interesting. Like, it kind of leads me to ask why, if we have all this science that is telling us that there's going to be consequences that happen that impact our water as a result of this activity, why let this activity happen in the first place, right? When we have, like you said, very little potable drinking water on this planet.
yeah. Well, that's a good question, especially on a day like today. But I would like to mention a couple of things too. Um, that there are certain assumptions that are still being made. And again, number one, the industry to this day refuses to acknowledge that these events happen. Now, they may be rare, few and far between, but when they do happen, like say the East Palestine derailment, it's catastrophic. Okay, you just need one well to go bad to really destroy an aquifer. Okay, and I think the next one is another case in point. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So this is, but this is also a case in point. This is going back to that same time, and this is from, I guess you guys put together this map or had someone do it for you. But there are 50 unconventional wells underneath the reservoir, and then there's a whole bunch of conventional wells. So you are looking at a major source of water for the region, and they are jeopardizing it through, and you can't fish in this reservoir, you can't kayak in this reservoir, but you can frack and drill. So that's kind of like, okay, so why is one thing okay and not the other? But if we go to the next one,
Yep.
or next slide, that brings us up to today, because that happened a few years ago, and they could say, oh, well, we're doing things better now. Well, this event happened in June of 2022. I was in another group, Center for Coalfield Justice. I got contacted by them saying, we had a problem down here in New Freeport. That's a conventional well, that picture there. And you can see that there's a big hole right next to that conventional well. And it turns out that the company was fracking a gas well. Okay, this was it's the lumber pad down in New Freeport. They were in the 100th stage of a 141 stage frack job. So that's in itself is amazing, because you can think of all the propellant and water that's used in chemicals to do that. But they were in their 100th stage when they lost pressure and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And they got a call from one of their workers that was home. The well was on their property. And they said, I got a geyser in my backyard now. I don't know what's going on. And that's paraphrasing, because I don't know exactly what he said. But regardless, and I've seen the videos, it wasn't quite a geyser, but there were fluids pulsing out of that hole.
Oh.
Now, some basic interest. Okay, I said already this was the 100th. So it was at a depth of 7,800 feet. Okay, so the unconventional well that they were fracking was at 7,800 feet depth. It was also over 6,000 feet from the well head itself, so the site of origin where the pad was. And it communicated with this conventional well all the way up to the surface. And that well was over 3,000 feet from the well bore of the unconventional well.
Wow.
So why I'm mentioning all this is, so number one, frack outs, as they're called, do happen. So now we have two examples. One of them was in the under the Beaver Run Reservoir, different company. And now we have this one here in New Freeport. Okay, but and then I got as I said, I got notified. I went down there. We were able to, over the next couple of weeks and months, get a bunch of samples. We now have 31 samples from different wells. That we saw evidence, again, using the technique and analysis that we do, that there was, evidence of conventional brine, evidence for unconventional brine, and even evidence that some wells had been contaminated by mine drainage, or AMD. And that's because there's active mining in the area as well. So basically, the take-home story here is that this frack out event moved things around, changed the water quality of the area, and impacted all these people. Now,
Yeah.
guess what? They don't have water. They
Right.
don't have an alternative source of water. Why? Because they're not 2,500 feet from the wellhead, nor had they had pre-drill done, because they weren't 2,500 feet from the wellhead.
That was going to be my question, John. Did they have the pre-drill testing done? And just to kind of let everybody know, so when an unconventional well, because some people might not know this, when an unconventional well is coming into your neighborhood, you may get a letter from either the company that's doing the work or a contractor of the company that's doing the work. And they're going to ask you, do you have a private water well or do you use city water? And the purpose for that letter is to determine, if they need to test your water. The problem with that is, as John stated, is that it is based on proximity to the well. And so this is showing us that the proximity that the DEP uses to to do that, to establish where drillers have to do their pre-drill testing, right? That proximity is incorrect, because this is much larger of an area, right? This, you said what, 2,500 feet or more than
Well,
20?
no, it's more. I mean, the distance from the unconventional well
Mm-hmm.
to the, as the crow flies, not even the fact that one is at 7,000 and the other's near the surface. Okay. I don't know exactly how deep the uh, conventional well is, but if you look at the hole there, it wasn't a blowout. I mean, it came up, it looks like it came up through the casing of the conventional well, but regardless, it was over 3,000 feet.
Yeah. Wow.
So, and then the other important thing is that we did go back. My student did go back a couple weeks ago, and there's still problems. They went and resampled, and the conditions are basically the same. In one case, maybe a little less methane in the water, but nevertheless, the same other parameters are there. Um, the other important thing is that we expanded the zone of impact. The company said, "Oh, it goes from this street from the well to this, to the end of this street." No, it's much wider.
Yeah.
And so there's things that, and there's data that I could talk about, but again, it's quite technical. But they still have not been provided an alternative source of water, and our recent testing suggests that there's still issues.
And do you know if the DEP, knowing that this is now happening, that where they should be testing the water, where the companies should be testing the water, if the DEP has plans on
But right now,
increasing?
I think that what I've understood, and there's going to be a town meeting next week, and I unfortunately have another event that I have to attend. But that they are apparently going to get an update. But as far as I know, that the company is now they're assessing how they're going to plug the well.
Okay.
And I'm sure that the DEP is just waiting to say that, well, once the well's plugged, the abandoned well, that things are going to get better.
Hmm.
But that still doesn't mean that things aren't bad now. I
Right.
mean, I've been advising those folks not to drink their water or use their water, um, because again, how did they know in the first place? And that's the other thing. How did they know? And again, it turns out that someone took a shower, and the next thing they knew, they were breaking out in a rash and things like that. And the mom went online to see what was going on, and there was this, Facebook posting or some neighborhood watch posting, which is like to tell all residents who live on Main Street and the fire hall west to Heron's Run that that's how they were notified. On their local community Facebook page. I mean, that's not how you tell people something bad just happened and they shouldn't drink their water or bathe in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So
anyway,
I want to mention something too really quick. So there are parameters that the DEP says, "Oh, so people within this certain spot or this certain area close to this fracking well pad, these are the people that should get pre-drill tests from the company, right? But let's say you don't live within that area, right? Had these people, knowing that fracking was happening, somewhat close to their home, I mean, maybe miles away, right?
yeah,
But knowing that this fracking was happening at a certain proximity to their home, they could, they could call you. You could come out and do some pre-drill testing, and at least they would have some type of evidence, right? Or they could go to, I mean, there's all kinds of places that do testing. It's expensive. It's really expensive,
right.
but they
And
could do.
I would say as far as that's concerned, find out, number one, not only how expensive it is, what are they going to do? How
Yeah.
are they going to sample? What is their sensitivity?
Mhm.
Like, what level of detection do they have? Is it milligrams per liter? Is it micrograms per liter? Is it relevant to the standards, which we're going to talk about shortly as we move along? But I just found out yesterday, and to my shock and amazement, that apparently the action level for methane in water, well water, is now been raised to 10 milligrams per liter. It was 7. It's now 10.
Why? Do we know?
I I have no idea, but Penn State's telling everybody, if it's above 10, you should be concerned and put in a venting system. But if it's below that, not a problem. And yet, just a short few years ago, it was 7.
Wow.
West Virginia's done the same thing. So again, I think this is evidence that, industry is getting to our regulators, and they're changing the regulations to fit the industry, not based on the science.
Mhm.
So again, and not even science, but also the regular, we know what happens when regulations are rolled back.
Right.
We just had a major bank failure because the regulations were rolled back. We just had a major derailment and an incredible disaster, and a community still at risk because regulations were rolled back. And,
Yeah.
and this is why we have to protect our water. There's a reason. And unfortunately, the paradox is, when things don't go wrong, it's because of good regulations.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that we need to stop them because nothing's gone wrong.
Yeah. And I
So
do want to
anyway,
mention before we go to our next slide. So CCJ, that's the organization that this happened in their neck of the woods, and that's the organization that helped respond to this. And so actually, that's the Center for Coalfield Justice, and they were collecting donations to buy these people water. So I just want to mention that.
thank
I know
you.
we donated, but if anybody is interested in donating, you can contact CCJ to see how you can help, because these people are, like you said, are still without water. They still don't have drinking water. And if we
And the
go to the,
well's still not plugged.
I know, right, right. So if we go to the next slide, yeah. So give us an update on what's going on with East
So
Palestine.
again, I was able to make some contacts with some folks, and we're working with groups in Ohio. Um, I've got collaborators now at Wayne State University. We had already been active in Ohio doing just basic testing for. They were concerned originally with the injection wells. There's over 220, maybe 250 injection wells in Ohio, so they're having some interesting things there. But this was basically what happened with the train derailment. And the things that spilled were vinyl chloride, ethylene glycol, monobutyl ether, isobutylene, ethyl hexyl acrylate, and butyl acrylate. And why I put the ethyl hexyl and butyl acrylate in red is because that's some of our preliminary evidence. This is, we went out and sampled March 1st, I think. And anyway, several weeks after the derailment. And this is the creek about 3 miles downstream of the crash site. And if you go out there and you look at it looks fine, nothing. But all you have to do is stick, a shovel into the sediment, and within 30 seconds, this kind of stuff that you can see, the oily stuff, floats to the surface. And that, we believe, is the ethyl hexyl and the butyl acrylate. But again, that's just our preliminary data. So, but nevertheless, it and the folks are still complaining that when it rains and things get stirred up and there's the stuff back in the air. But that's not necessarily when they're out sampling. When they're out sampling, it's a sunny day, and they can sample the water, and the water looks clean. But as soon as you stir up the sediment, we don't know how far down it goes.
Yeah.
And we were hoping to get an NSF rapid, but NSF told us they're no longer accepting rapid proposals for East Palestine. So that, we were very disappointed about that.
Yeah.
So hopefully people are getting funding to actually go there and do some more testing, but it's clear that the testing has to be done and done once again appropriately and at the level of detection that is required.
Well, in our next slide, it kind of talks about like the where. If people don't know where East Palestine is and how close it is to Pennsylvania, there were lots of people in Pennsylvania that were impacted. This is a map that you put together.
Yeah, yeah, my asterisk disappeared. So where it says Big Valley Raceway at the bottom, that's where I actually sampled.
Okay.
So the um, uh, the, the the derailment occurred near the leaky oil company. I don't know if, well, that's what it sounds like, or leak oil company. Anyway, it occurred up there, and it made its way all the way down, at least that far. And Arsenko has actually found evidence for butyroacrylate in their Ohio River samples. So we really don't know how far the contamination goes, and really they're focusing on the spill area. They're not necessarily focusing downstream, and yet there are people that live all around, all down that Leslie Run, for example. And there's
Right.
people, and you don't see Nagley, but Nagley is to the south, and Unity is up to the north. And again, it's a blast zone.
Could
So,
you could you kind of speak about, people might say, well, it's in the creek, so how can it get into your private water? How can it get into your
well,
well?
the other thing is that apparently, and the Ohio EPA fortunately did a study back in 2019. The area is on top of a shallow aquifer, which basically means that if you drill down maybe 25 feet, that's where you'll hit water. So
Oh,
the water table is rather high, and it's actually um, there's a rock layer that that you hit down at like 25 feet. So it is what we call an unconfined near surface aquifer. So what that means is that rainwater and other stuff goes right into that aquifer and can percolate right down.
okay.
So a lot of people have shallow wells, and those who are on well water, if they could afford to actually blast through that rock layer and go deeper, they may be in good shape. But those folks that are drawing from the shallow aquifer are, I would say, are at risk, depending on where they are in the flow. And of course, you're going to hear experts say, "Oh, well, they're going in the wrong direction. They don't have to worry," and things like that. But anyway,
Yeah.
water flows the way it's going to flow.
That's right. It takes the path of least resistance. I learned that when I had water coming through my wall from my chimney, and we
Yeah.
had no idea why, like how it was getting in the house. So, water just does what it wants to do. Can we? So, if we go to the next slide, I think you touched a little bit upon this, but tell us a little bit more about
Yeah.
the.
All right. So again, there's public drinking water and there's private drinking water. For public drinking water, those water authorities have to comply with the national primary drinking water standards that the US EPA sets. So things like arsenic, which I'm very familiar with, the drinking water standard there is 10 parts per billion, or 10 micrograms per liter. Uh, Radiation, total radiation is 5 micrograms per liter, or excuse me, 5 picocuries per liter. Okay. But there's other things. There's acrylates and antimony and other things. So there's a number. But obviously, this list only goes on for a couple of pages. So there's obviously a lot more chemicals that could be regulated. There's a lot more chemicals that should be regulated, and the levels set at an appropriate level. Again, that begs the question of how are these things tested for? What kind of equipment do you need, and how much does it cost? So again, there are things that we would call, indicators that can provide, some good indication. Then the second page is basically what they call the secondary primary drinking water standards, and oddly enough, um, they're referred to as cosmetic because they can, it's color, taste, smell, and they're things like iron and manganese, chloride. Um, and of course, total dissolved solids. Sulfate is another one. And so when you look at those parameters, you're like, gee, that's a lot of those are associated with brines and mine drainage. Why are they on page, the secondary? They should be maybe on the primary because again, we know high salt, what causes high blood pressure? High iron can have neurological issues. High manganese has neurological issues. And in certain cases, chronic exposure to high levels of manganese can have as much an impact on IQ as lead. So
Wow.
these are studies that have been, a lot of them have come out of the Columbia University School of Public Health's Superfund program. But we now know that manganese should actually be regulated at like on the first page. But again, we are remiss in the fact that years ago, through legislation, we our toxic chemical inventory is called TSCA, and those water quality standards have not been updated, and they are desperately needed to do. But again, it costs money, and if we don't know about it, then it's not a problem.
Okay. Okay.
So that's our primary standards. And then as far as your private water wells, you don't have to report, you don't have to do anything with the EPA, but these are guidelines for you to know whether or not your water is safe to drink.
Right. And tell us a little bit about the next slide. We're talking about disinfectant byproducts, right? So, what is a disinfectant byproduct?
Okay, so getting back to the public drinking water, um, again, they have to make sure that they're, not only that they've taken all the bad stuff out, hopefully, gotten down the organic load, gotten down things like nitrogen levels and phosphorus levels that can lead to algal blooms and other things. Um, but they also have to provide a bit of safety to make sure that microbes aren't going to grow before they put it into the distribution system. And so there's several different ways, like there's UV or ultraviolet light is used to kill bacteria. Um, there's ozonation, which is also a way of sanitizing the water. Again, you can imagine that if something is, hyperoxygenated, that it may have some issues, especially with metal pipes. But the primary means is chlorination. And the issue with chlorination is that if there's residual organics and things like bromide, they form these things called trihalomethanes. So you have chloroform, bromoform, dibromochloromethane, and these compounds can cause liver cancer and other issues. And they're regulated. Your water authority has to test for them on a quarterly basis. But here's the rub: only if they are out of compliance 4 quarters in a row, they don't have to let their constituents know.
Yeah.
So how long is 4 quarters?
Yeah. And I
It's a
remember,
dollar. It's a
right.
year.
Yeah, yeah. And back in 2019, I think it was when like right around the stuff that was happening around the Beaver Run Reservoir, the stuff we talked about before. Um, we received a letter in the mail saying that basically that they were seeing high levels of this what, total organic carbons, and it was like it was crazy. The letter was like, oh, there's no problem with the water quality. It's fine. We just have to tell you that there's a problem because it's been a problem for a year. And it was really confusing. And I remember having a meeting at our office about this. And one of the local scientists from Seton Hill, or I'm sorry, from St. Vincent came, Dr. Richburg, I'm sorry, Dr. Cynthia Walter. I don't know if you remember her. She was
Mhm.
at some of those meetings with us, but but yeah, talking about the trihalomethanes, and we did a really extensive study actually. Thanks to Cindy and some of the folks in Westmoreland County. And it's on our website. We did a 135-page paper that really studied like over time how the water quality at the Beaver Run Reservoir has changed. We used like the publicly available records from the Water Authority for like, all of the parameters that they had been testing for, and we kind of got down to some reasons why this is happening. I think we have another slide that has more disinfectant byproducts on.
Yeah, and then the other one are called the haloacetic acids, and they also are the result of this chlorination process. And again, both of them, whether it's the trihalomethanes or the haloacetic acids, the presence can lead to bladder, rectal, and colon cancers. And once again, it's they say that it's not an issue, it's not a problem, and they're just reporting because they're mandated to report. But there's a reason why they have to report, because it is a problem. Okay, it is an issue, and especially for folks at risk. These standards are general standards and guidelines for the general populace, but there are people that shouldn't be drinking this water if it contains these contaminants. So it's really important that they do that. Now, the alternative is to use chloramination, but there's been issues with chloramination, because if you don't get, believe it or not, one of the other things that they will add to the drinking water is corrosion inhibitors. And again, they're safe to drink, but the point is that if you get that wrong, then you wind up with lead leaching out of your pipes and fixtures.
Yeah. And
So
yeah,
yeah.
they had a big problem with this at PWSA, and they had multiple violations with DEP and a consent order because basically all the lead pipes in Pittsburgh were leaching all the lead, and it was causing a lot of problems for the people that were drinking this water. I did put the link to the report. Thank you, Chelsea, for providing that link. I put the link to the report in the notes or in the chat boxes. Again, I want to remind people, if you have questions for Dr. Stolz, you can put them in the chat for us. Or if not, this recording is going to be available on YouTube and Facebook later. So you can contact him later if you have questions that may arise if you're rewatching it. So let's talk about what's in the water. That's the next slide. So tell us what all this means. What is conductivity?
So these are your typical parameters that, this is baseline stuff. So conductivity is basically a measure of the dissolved materials. And we can easily do that with what we, even a handheld conductivity meter. It basically, water doesn't necessarily conduct electricity, but stuff that is dissolved in it does. And so the more stuff that's dissolved, the higher your conductivity. And it's measured in microsiemens per centimeter, but there's a conversion factor of 0.65. Obviously different things will affect the conductivity differently, but the general rule of thumb is 0.65. So if you get a reading of say 1,000 microsiemens, then that would translate to 650 milligrams per liter, and that's the MCL for that in the secondary standards is 500 milligrams per liter. So if you have over 500 milligrams per liter of dissolved solids, you got chunky water. So that's conductivity and TDS. pH is a measure of whether or not it's acidic or basic. It's a 0 to 14 scale range, and it's logarithmic, not to be complicated, but the EPA says 6.25 to 8.2, actually 6.5 to 8.5. So circumneutral is 7, so that's good to shoot for. 7 to 8 is okay. Alkalinity is actually a measure of the buffering capacity. We have hard water in this area, so we have a lot of carbonate. Hardness is mineral content based on the amount of calcium and magnesium. TOC, or total organic carbon, that's again, obviously our water sources have organics in them. Life is organic. Methane comes in two flavors, biogenic or thermogenic. And you see I put the action level at 6 milligrams per liter. It's now up to 10 milligrams per liter, apparently. But at 28 milligrams per liter, it comes out of solution, and that's when you can light your fire, your faucet on fire. And the difference between biogenic and thermogenic, biogenic is, cow farts and swamp gas. It's biologically produced. Um, Thermogenic is from gas wells and oil wells. Okay, and it's the same stuff, but it has different, we call them isotopic signatures. Don't want to necessarily get involved in that right now, but the thing is, you can tell the difference between the two. The other important thing is with thermogenic, it usually travels with other organics like ethane and propane, so that when we see those associated with high levels of methane, we take that as presumptive evidence that it's a thermogenic source and not swamp gas. Your bacteria, you've got the coliforms, which are your fecal bacteria. There's a bunch of other ones that the DEP talks about, like iron bacteria and other things. That requires growth media and making sure that whoever is collecting your samples is doing it sterilely and analyzes it within 8 to 24 hours, because otherwise, microbes are everywhere and you have to be careful. E. coli, everybody knows Escherichia coli is a common gut microbe. There are good ones, there are bad ones. They're the ones that can call hemorrhagic E. coli, the nasty stuff. But again, those results will be in colony counts and, presence, absence kind of thing.
So
And then,
when they say like boil your water when there's a boil advisory, is that to
yeah,
kill
that's
the,
to get rid of the microbes.
okay, yep.
Yeah. So, and we've already talked about the primary and secondary standards, and of course the trihalomethanes. So these are things that you want to make sure this is all related to, both private and public water. Not so much the trihalomethanes. And then the abbreviations, maximum contaminant level, these are set by the EPA, and that's the US EPA. Milligrams per liter are basically parts per million. Micrograms per liter are parts per billion. And unfortunately, we still haven't switched over to the metric system. So, it is what it is.
And if we go to the next slide, it's just like an alphabet soup here.
Oh yeah, no, this is, so you get your results, and one of the first things you have to also be aware of, everyone's proud of their standards and their QA, QC, or quality assurance and quality control. So you'll often get 10 pages of results and only one of them really makes any, is the important stuff. The rest of them, if they were testing for organics and they had to do some extractions, they will give you some data on their efficiencies and recoveries. Then there are other things, if they use standards, they'll give you their standard tests, and it's like, okay, but what's in my water and what does it mean? And so U means the analysis was performed, but nothing was detected, which means, again, it's not to say that it's not there, but it's below the detection limits of the equipment or tests that they used to determine that particular analyte, as they are called. J is estimate value, detectable but not quantifiable. We find that, like when we're doing our testing, we'll often see a little hump, but it's just a little hump. It's suggestive, but we can't really quantify it. So again, that's, it's there, but we can't tell you how much it is. And it's, and presumptive evidence of a compound, that's a good one. B, this is the one that sticks with me all the time. If the DEP gives you a B, it says that the compound was found in their blank. And if that's the case, you can hand back the results to them and say, please retest my water because somebody screwed up. It was either a lab contaminant or somehow, whether the bottles weren't washed properly or whatever. But, I have seen determination letters where they have actually said that the compound like acetone was found in the blank, and therefore it's not in your drinking water, even though in your well water, even though we found it in your well water.
Okay, that
Seriously.
makes sense to me.
Seriously. Okay. Seriously. E, this is another one, concentration exceeds calibration. This is also often, you'll see this with the commercial well. They don't want to have to rerun a sample, and they don't want to rerun another set of standards. But sometimes the concentration is above what they ran for their standard curve to tell them how much is actually in there. And if you're good, you're going to have to do dilutions. You're also going to have to do additional standards. So we have low standards and high standards, or depending on what we are assuming the concentrations are.
All right.
So I think we just had a little glitch there, and some other things. Okay, but anyway, an MDL is the method detection limit.
This
So
is
that's
good. Yeah. Yeah.
all right.
So, and then you have an example on the next slide, right? This is what a
Yeah.
report's going to look like when you get it.
Yeah, and again, over the years, the our own PADEP has used what they call suite codes to basically, they've determined that certain parameters are useful for them to make their determinations, even though they've tested for a lot more. And they push back saying, well, we can't have standards for everything. Well, nobody has standards for everything. Okay, you run a suite of standards to calibrate the equipment and make sure that it's running appropriately. If you're looking for something in particular, yes, then you might run a specific standard. So like we have standards now for BTEX and we have MEP, which is methane, ethane, ethene, and propane. We use that to, you know, do our quality assurance for our analysis. But anyway, your typical ICP-MS method 200.7 EPA will give you a suite of almost 30 metals. So, and some of them are important, like arsenic, but they won't necessarily be reported by the DEP if they test your water. So you want to request a full report.
Okay. So if somebody gets this, they are to call the something like this. They're to call the DEP and say, "I want a full report."
Yeah,
Correct. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. And if you have any further questions, you can contact Dr. Stolz.
Running out of time here.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Well, how many slides do we have left?
We've got a couple more. All right. So
We'll
next,
zip right through them.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, all
this,
right, we can skip this one, but actually, what that one is, go back. This is the actual wording from the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So if anybody has any questions, it defines, this is section 322, it defines what hydraulic fracturing is and underground injection. So A means the subsurface emplacement of fluids by injection, and B excludes the underground injection of natural gas for purposes for storage. So underground storage. So we have problems in Clearfield. People are sitting on a giant gas bubble because it's a storage field. And then second is underground injection of fluids and propane edges. So basically fracking is exempt. All right, continue. That's the wording right there. So
we do have one question from our group. Actually, she said two questions. If I want to get my water tested, what is the procedure, and what do a test for? So I guess that,
So we if you you can give us a call at the center, or you can send me an email, stolz@duq.edu. We will test for salts like chloride, bromide, but also nitrate, nitrite, phosphate, sulfate. We will test for metals like calcium, magnesium, manganese, iron, et cetera, and then the light hydrocarbons. Although right now we're actually switched over to look for more complex things, including trihalomethane. So we'll be testing some public drinking water in the next few months.
yeah. And so what I did was, and so if they live near a pad, so yeah, so I would say if you live near a pad, and if it's any indication, what Dr. Stolz was talking about earlier about, the distance, like these people that had the frack out, they lived much further away from the pad than the DEP would request the industry test for. So just it's important to know what's around you, and that's the best way you can do it. And then I also put Dr. Stoll's email. You said Stolz at duq.edu.
Yeah, that's it.
Yep, that's in there too. So you can give him a ring or email and find out. So tell me a little bit about this graph real quick.
Well, what this is just showing and it's blocking the first one, NEPA. But there was amazing stuff going on in the 70s and 80s, and all these things: the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and since that time, these legislations and regulations have been attacked repeatedly. The Superfund program is on life support, and yet companies are still polluting and should be getting fined. And again, the last administration rolled back over 100 environmental regulations, and we're reaping the benefits right now with train derailments and other disasters, and even, and I'm going to say even bank failures
Yeah.
that we put into place, even the latest, and not to say that, I'm harping on the bank failure, but Dodd-Frank's was to prevent exactly what happened. And they figured, hey, nothing's happened since 2008. We're okay. We're good. No, it's still going to happen. So anyway, we have to keep our water resources protected, which I think is the last slide.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you go to the next slide. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was from a forum that was held in Ambridge several years ago. But the EPA funds, the US EPA funds a local through our PADEP. It's called a source water protection plan. So
Hmm.
that you get your community together, you get your public water people together, you get your industry together, and just say, hey, look, it's all in our best interest to protect our water resources, because even a company is not going to be able to make their products if they got crappy water.
Hmm.
US Steel was complaining back in 2009 because their water was going bad because we were allowing the brine going directly to waste treatment plants, and it was contaminating our rivers that these companies were using for their source water. So everybody's impacted, whether it's industry or, us folks. So yes, if you have a community and you're concerned about it, you can create a safe drinking water source water protection plan.
Yeah. Yeah, and before we hop off, I want to make sure we talk about your book a little bit and where people can get it. We just ordered our copy, by the way, so
Thank you.
we do have a library here at Protect PT. If you're in the Harrison City area, you can come by our office, and you can borrow it, or if you want to buy it, tell us how to buy the book.
Yeah, you can get it through Cambridge University Press, and there's currently a 20% discount on it. I realize it's an expensive book. It's about 118 bucks now, but it's over 400 pages, 16 chapters. It includes chapters on air, radioactivity, some more technical stuff like the isotope things of how we can actually, um, you know, determine whether it's a Marcellus gas or a Utica gas or whatever. But the microbiology, some basics. I wrote 2 chapters, one on just all the oil and gas reserves, the shale reserves. I mean, they're all over the world. And believe it or not, Saudi Arabia right now is thinking about fracking. Okay, they still have some of the world's largest conventional reserves, but they want to join the fracking. So and they don't have water. Anyway, so a lot of things, some basics on how the processes are done and the infrastructure that's required. The cover actually is from Bob Donnan, who does his Marcellus Air or Air Marcellus. I always
Mhm.
forget which way it goes, but anyway, that's actually an e-frac. They're using electric pumps, so they're more environmentally friendly. Um,
Oh, nice. Okay, so I'm going to grab the link from the chat. Thank you, Chelsea, for providing that link. So the link to Dr. Stoll's book is now in the chat. So if you want to grab the book, you can. And if we go to the last slide, yeah. So we're over time, but only by a couple minutes. So great job. There's a lot of information we covered in a short amount of time. And so I want to thank Dr. Stolz for being here today and for joining us on World Water Day to talk about our drinking water, our public sources of water, our private sources of drinking water, the standards, why it's important to protect these things, and how there are industries right now that are polluting these things. So, we want to thank you, Dr. Stolz, for being with us and for joining us on World Water Day. We want you to join us next month as well. We're actually going to be talking to Tiffany Tolton, and she is a local person working on planting trees and in Hazelwood. So we were at the climate convergence with her, and just I'm really excited to have her as a guest as well. If you would like to take a survey, we have our protectbt.info/lunch survey. Tell us what you think about the information we're gathering here today and sharing with you, and let us know how we can get more information to you, and what types of things you'd like to have on the program on the future. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Stolz,
Thank you.
and happy World Water Day, everyone.
Happy
Have a
World Water Day.
good afternoon. All right. See ya. Bye.